Thank you for letting me know that you're going to duck out for your exams. Today, what I'm going to talk about primarily is my major research project that I've been working on for the past 4.5 years. And that's looking at the dimensionality within the institutional environment of police chiefs and its impact on those agency goals. Before getting into that project, though, I want to talk about my background a little bit, where I've come from. So I've been fortunate enough to work on 2 NIJ grants while I was a grad student at Sam Houston, the first one being the National Police Platform Project. For that project, I was involved in surveying police recruits at a large southwestern U.S. city's police academy. Great learning experience. One of the things that I found out is the proper time to survey police recruits related to civil liability is not right after they've received that training from the DA. After they've received that training, they want to make sure that their surveys aren't going to be subpoenaed, that they're not going to be subpoenaed to testify to what they put in a survey maybe 10 years earlier in their career. So that was an interesting experience talking to them about and assuring them that it's de-identified data. The other NIJ project that I worked on was an evaluation of the ATF's National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, or NIBIN, and what NIBIN does is it attempts to make connections between bullet casings, bullets that are found at crime scenes from test fires when guns are taken off of arrestees. And the point of identifying links between casings and bullets is to connect crime scenes. Now, the drawback with NIBIN, it's not as good as identifying the perpetrator of a crime like CODIS, because you're identifying guns. You're linking guns to crime scenes. You're not linking people. One of the things that we found out with this project is sometimes gangs have guns that are community guns. You might have a gun that you give to a member of the gang to do a crime. They commit the crime, and then the gun is handed off to the next person. Also, what we found in Cincinnati is that they don't have a lot of hits because the Ohio River is such a great destination for firearms. Once the firearm is used in a crime, if it's a serious crime, it's placed in the river. Another thing that I got to do with the NIBIN project is an actual site visit in Stockton, California. There we were able to interview homicide detectives, interview lab personnel. There's a paper that is going back out for review related to this site visit, but the unique situation in Stockton was that they changed the people, processes, and technology all at the same time when it came to how they were utilizing those 3 components and the NIBIN system, and they brought in someone from Santa Ana PD in California that had had good success with the NIBIN system. And after bringing in that individual, Stockton was experiencing increased efficiency and effectiveness with their NIBIN program. Where most of what I'm going to talk about today comes from is the study of law enforcement executives. This is a program that comes out of the Texas Police Chief Leadership Series, which is administered by the Bill Blackwood Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas. And this project was one that's near and dear to my heart. It was one that I started on my 2nd year in grad school. I was there for the initial meeting. I got to be part of writing the survey instrument. I was the one that went and pre-tested the instrument with an independent school district police chief, with a local police chief. Unfortunately, we weren't able to arrange a special department police chief to pre-test the instrument, but I was able to pre-test that instrument, and some of the things that we'll talk about a little more later, or at least I'll talk about a little more later, is the institutional sovereigns or community partners, stakeholders that we identified when we constructed the survey are actually the ones that are coming out as important in our focus group meetings now that are being conducted by the grad student that took over this project from me and Bill King, who's continuing the project. The other thing about this project and the NIBIN project is that I still continue to have access to these data, so there are projects that I'm going to continue working on long term. The other thing that I would like to do with the study of law enforcement executives, I actually applied for an internal grant at UCF that unfortunately was not funded, but I want to take the project national. I want to do a national mail survey of just a small portion, the portion I'm going to talk about related to working and political environment, and chief's demographics. So I'm hoping to do that in the near future. So areas that I focus on in my research are police organizations, police leadership, and violent crime. These come out of the projects that I've talked about working on already. When I talk about my interest in police organizations, I want to know how organizational structure impacts agencies. There's a paper, it's the one I'm working on the most currently that I'll talk about a little later, that looks at how organizational structure impacts women in policing. So that's an example of that type of research that I'm doing. Also, I'm very interested in organizational theories, specifically contingency and institutional theory. With contingency theory, everything is based on rational choices by organizations, the efficiency and effectiveness of their outputs, whereas in institutional theory, the primary goal of the organization is to build legitimacy within their community and then leverage that legitimacy that they hold. I also am looking at police leadership, specifically police executive leadership, and how they impact their organizations. The way that a chief, interacts with the community that I'm going to talk about later is this construction of social reality, which is a process where there's interaction between the community, there's interaction between the chief and the department, and it's a give and take relationship. So community learns about the chief learns about the community, and give and take creates that social reality, and that social reality is built on legitimacy. You could consider legitimacy the currency of social reality. Also, like I was saying before, police executive decision making is something that I'm interested in when it comes to police leadership, and talking to Chief Masterson, succession planning. It's how do we identify lower level leaders within police organizations that are going to be groomed for the future as the top police officer. They're going to be the chief someday. How do we identify those, young middle managers or younger leaders in an organization, and then how do we prepare them to take over the entire organization? And finally, my interest in violent crime comes from my work on the United Project. A lot of firearms evidence was processed through that project, so I'm interested in firearms research. One of the areas that I think is lacking in the literature is research related to robbery. So if we could do robbery-related research with firearms, also looking at situational variable research where you look at how situations increase violence and how firearms are used in that violence. So the main project that I'm going to talk about, again, is that dimensionality within the institutional environment of police chiefs. And we're really looking at institutional theory as proposed by Meyer and Rowan and DiMaggio and Powell, and this is the neo-institutional theory. Meyer and Rowan emphasize the myth and ceremony that organizations create when establishing this legitimacy, and DiMaggio and Powell focus on how organizations change when their legitimacy is questioned. So they have identified 3 ways that organizations change. I'll talk about those a little more, but the overarching name of those are institutional isomorphisms. When we talk about institutional theory in the police, we're really going back to the work of Crank and Langworthy in '92, where they really make that initial connection between institutional theory and the police. And we're going back to Crank's article from '03 that does an update, that '92 piece. So when we look at institutionalization, when we think about what has been institutionalized in policing, we're talking about uniforms, badges, the carrying of firearms, routine patrol. These are all things that are deemed legitimate by the community that surrounds a policing organization. In fact, if an officer is not dressed in a uniform, they don't have the same legitimacy as being a uniformed officer. So that uniform is something that identifies a legitimate police officer. Again, the institutionalization process is that interaction process, the construction of social reality. And again, institutional theory is not emphasizing efficiency and effectiveness. That is a key critique that Donaldson points out. But the issue with institutional theory is that legitimacy. Legitimacy is the most important thing. It's the currency of the organization. Also, the institutional environment is the totality of institutional sovereigns or stakeholders that surround an organization. And these institutional sovereigns have the ability to make an impact on the organization. So the organization evaluates their attribution of legitimacy to the sovereign and how important that sovereign is to the organization. But the institutional sovereigns, again, when we talk to chiefs, these are people they're going to call stakeholders, community partners, things like that. And finally, institutional isomorphisms are how organizations change. They can be coercive, such as being induced to do things. This has been used to describe the rapid expansion of cops because there were grants available that community policing was then deemed legitimate and it had funding available. So based on that funding, police departments adopted. We also have mimetic changes. And these changes are when organizations identify another organization as legitimate and therefore copy the things that they are doing. They don't evaluate whether that's something that's going to fit their organization specifically, but they identify a legitimate organization and then copy their methods. And finally, there are normative changes. And this is the professionalization type of change. This is increased educational standards. And all of these things impact organizational structure. So this slide just is a condensed version of the last one showing within institutional theory, the independent variables are going to be the institutional sovereigns, the social reality, and institutional isomorphisms, and the dependent variable is going to be the organizational structure. The issue within institutional theory, though, is that it's a difficult thing to measure. It's difficult to measure the interaction and how that interaction actually impacts the organization. It's difficult to measure legitimacy. So researchers have stated that any test of institutional theory, even just a component of institutional theory, is beneficial. So in this project, we're looking at how does an institutional environment affect police organizations vis-a-vis a chief's perceptions of the environment. Going back again to the work by Crank and Langworthy, they point out that the organizational theory literature, the business literature that Donaldson's putting forward, is not directly applicable to the police because the police are not profit-driven. They are legitimacy-driven. They're based on the relationships that they maintain within their community. So they have to be cognizant of the competing and conflicting demands of their institutional sovereigns, and they have to be able to address those in a way that maintains their legitimacy. So that goes to the construction of social reality. An example of this is Katz's work in a Midwestern city with police gang units. The national media at the time of the formation of the gang unit was identifying gang problems across the U.S. as a major problem. So the community came to the police department and told them that they needed to address the gang problem. The gang problem, unfortunately, according to the police, was not there. So under pressure from the community, the police did establish a gang unit, but the gang unit wasn't directly addressing gang crime at the time of its formation. Institutional theory has also been applied to community policing, specifically that rapid expansion and use of community policing. When we also look at critiques of the rapid expansion, Zhao, Loveridge, and Robinson point out that even though organizations stated that they were doing community policing, their technical core or how they were operating hadn't in fact changed. So they were conducting policing as you would expect in the professional era, but claiming that it was community-oriented policing. It's also been used to apply terrorism preparedness and homeland security to policing. Giblin and Burris They created a measurement model related to those institutional isomorphisms because one of the critiques over the years of DiMaggio and Powell's statement of those isomorphisms is that they didn't state whether they were mutually exclusive. If one type of isomorphism occurs, are the other two not possible then? And what Giblin and Burris found is that No, you can have multiple types of isomorphism. There's different reasons that these changes are made. So these data come from the Texas Police Chief Leadership Series program that's operated through LEMIT that I was talking about before. And what the TPCLS is it's a state-mandated continuing education program for Texas police chiefs, which is fantastic, because they all have to come through this program. Some of those are operated at LEMIT, which is connected to Sam Houston State University, and then the other half of the training sessions are conducted by LEMIT personnel that travel throughout the state of Texas, and they do other sites that they conduct the class at. But it was a self-administered paper survey, and we were fortunate that chiefs were given the survey in the first hour of their training. So when chiefs sat down, they were introduced to the program, and then we were introduced to the chiefs. And we told the chiefs that they could complete the survey if they wished. We had a consent form for them, or they could go get a cup of coffee. They didn't have to look at our survey. So what we found is most chiefs were interested in the survey. They wanted to do the survey. Those that were not interested initially went, they got their cup of coffee, they used the restroom, they checked their email, they did all the things that they needed to do and found out that they still had 45 minutes to kill before the next session. So they sat down and they took a look at our survey, and most of them did end up completing our survey. So we had 446 completed surveys out of 465 participants. After data cleaning, we had 421 surveys that were left for further analysis. But you can see the specific directions that were given to chiefs related to ranking institutional sovereigns and agency goals. So they were ranked on a Likert scale from 0, not important at all, to 5, extremely important. And we collected more demographic variables related to the chiefs, but some of them did not have enough variation to be included. And I want to point out race now, because there was an 80-20 split. We had to actually dichotomize race. We initially collected more racial categories, but with the demographics of chiefs in Texas, we had to dichotomize it to non-white and white. So we had 80% white chiefs, 20% non-white chiefs, and I think that relation, or that distribution, is really driving the findings related to race. One of the things that we need to do is have more minority chiefs hopefully participate in the survey. But we looked at age of chiefs, their length of time in law enforcement as a supervisor in their current department and as the chief of their current department. Education also had to be dichotomized, those without a bachelor's degree or those with a bachelor's degree or more. We looked at whether they had been a chief in another agency, whether they were hired externally or internally, and we also looked at their jurisdiction. So urban serves as the reference category, and we had metropolitan, suburban, micropolitan, suburban, rural, ISD, and special. ISD is going to be an independent school district police department, because there are a significant number of those in Texas. Special departments are going to be like river authorities, port authorities, airport authorities. Metropolitan suburban and micropolitan suburban are based on census definitions. So metropolitan is going to be those counties surrounding an urban core of 50,000 or more. Micropolitan is going to be those counties surrounding an urban core of 10,000 to 49,999. When we looked at the environment of police chiefs, we had 31 variables or institutional sovereigns. I conducted factor analysis, and we saw that there are 7 factors when it comes to the environment of chiefs. Rather than using factor scores as our variable, we used summated scales for the environment, because one of the variables, the major cities newspaper, loaded very highly on both the national media and the local media, and we felt that it should be on the local media, but unfortunately that was the second highest loading, and so when we tried to take the factor scores in SPSS, we couldn't manually put it where we wanted it to be, so we had to create the summated scales. I'll show you the Crown Box Alpha in a minute, but we were comfortable with all of those alpha values and were able to continue with those summated scales. And we use the environment as both dependent and independent variables. We see how chiefs' demographics impact their perceptions of the environment, and then how perceptions of the environment impact agency goals. So when we looked at agency goals, we had 20 variables, 20 agency goals. And again, avoiding lawsuits was one of the agency goals, which loaded very highly on both image variables. So again, we created those summated scales, and based on the alphas, we were comfortable moving forward with those. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to get all of these on the same slide, but we have the first environment variable, first factor, and that was related to state and federal law enforcement organizations. You see both the law enforcement organizations, but Department of Homeland Security, State Attorney General, those types of organizations. We also had the national media. We used primarily print media, and then we looked at national TV or radio news. And we have other local criminal justice organizations. So the local courts, the prosecutor, county sheriff, and other independent police departments. We also have law enforcement employee and community organizations. So this included officers' unions, the FOP, policing associations, advocacy groups. We had the medical providers in the area. And then we also had elected representatives at all levels of government loading together, and the local media like I was talking about before. But looking at all of those alpha values, they were all greater than 0.65, 0.7, so we felt comfortable moving forward with those. This is just to show you the mean level of importance that chiefs attribute to these individual factors. So we see that the most important is other local criminal justice organizations, and the least important is the national media. When we talk about why dimensionality is important, previously you look at Wilson's work back in '68, and he identified the fact that there was a political environment around police organizations, but he didn't go beyond that, and he didn't specifically say that, you know, the political environment was this one specific group. He talked about how there's just this political environment and how it impacts organizations. So this research shows that there is a political environment. There are also 6 other specific groups that chiefs identify, and previously that hadn't been empirically done in the policing literature and policing organizations literature. We see that a lot of people talk anecdotally about how these groupings exist, but it hadn't just been demonstrated in this fashion.
If I could ask a question about the medical providers, how was
Yes.
that, what were you asking them with reference to medical providers?
We were asking
curious.
how important they feel that the local crime lab is, how much the agency can be impacted if the local crime lab or the hospitals, fire and EMS decide to focus attention on their department.
Oh, okay.
So in conversations with this, with this topic among chiefs in those focus groups that unfortunately I haven't been able to participate in, but a friend of mine is still working with the project. What I think is driving the medical providers factor is the EMS or fire services in local hospitals.
Okay.
Because you have police that respond to scenes with fire and EMS. You also have emergency situations at emergency rooms. So that, I think, is what's driving that factor.
Okay. Sorry, I was trying to figure out what that connection was.
Oh, no problem. But again, this shows that chiefs identify these groups, but they also view them with differing levels of importance. So again, looking at the organization's goals, we have local and internal organizational image. This is looking at citizen satisfaction, citizen fear of crime, employee satisfaction, positive relationships with local organizations. Then external organizational image is related to their image with organizations that are further from their organization, state, federal, adopting innovations, things of that nature. And then we have law enforcement activities, which are the technical core of policing. So enforcing laws and ordinances, maintaining order, controlling crime rates. And this is showing that the agency goals don't have as much variation in importance, and we see that law enforcement activities are important to chiefs, so chiefs are promoting that technical core within policing. When we move into how chiefs' demographics impact their perceptions of institutional sovereigns, though, we're seeing that the adjusted R-squareds are relatively low. As chiefs are more educated, they have a higher perception of elected officials and local media, but we see that age doesn't impact their perceptions. Their length of time in law enforcement or as a supervisor, their length of time in their current department doesn't impact their perceptions of these institutional sovereigns within their community. Time as chief does, and it impacts the perceptions of other local criminal justice organizations, law enforcement employee community organizations, and medical providers, looking at possibly the police executive cynicism literature. It might be that the more they work with these individuals, they may not have the positive relationships with these individuals, and it impacts their perceptions of those within their environments. Again, the impacts of race, this is showing that non-white chiefs have more positive perceptions of these institutional sovereigns than white chiefs. But again, I want to be really cautious with that because of the breakdown in chiefs being 80-20. Also, what I find interesting here is the ISD and special police departments. Specifically, ISD chiefs, in talking during the pre-testing of the instrument, in talking to chiefs at TPCLS instruction, ISD chiefs don't feel that other local police organizations treat them as local police departments. They are fully sworn law enforcement officers in Texas, so they really have a positive view of other local law enforcement because that's how they see themselves. Also, with the special police departments, they don't necessarily have a community that they serve, so this sovereign is not important to them. They don't really have to address community issues because they're working in a port, they're working on a river system. Now, this is applying individual chiefs' characteristics to agency goals. Again, looking at race, that probably is related to the 80-20 split. Again, the adjusted R-squareds are very low. Looking at what is significant here, I think we're also getting into that cynicism literature. The longer that you've worked with these individuals, you may not have positive relationships with them. Now, this is considering the perceptions of the institutional environment and their impact on agency goals. We see a substantial increase in the R-squareds. We see also, which supports institutional theory, that organizational image, both the local and internal, and the external organizational image are impacted more than law enforcement activities when it comes to this interactive process with institutional sovereigns. So, the other thing that we take away from this is that all of these relationships, with the exception of the national media, are positive. So as chiefs view sovereigns more positively, also want to emphasize these goals as well. This is a grouping of 3 models that include all of the chiefs' individual demographic variables and institutional sovereigns, but to make it readable, only those individual those individual demographics that were statistically significant are included. And what we see here is that the adjusted R-squareds are not increasing substantially by including individual characteristics. So it really is perceptions of the environment that are driving the relationships here with the goals. And it's that important thing that we're looking also again at local internal organizational image and external organizational image being more important to chiefs based on their perceptions of sovereigns. So this tells us that The institutional environment of police chiefs is incredibly complex. Organizations are impacted by individual characteristics. The institutional environment also affects organizations. Looking at this research, we believe that chiefs are the ones that are impacting their agencies. As the leader of that agency, they can set the tone for their agency. But also we're seeing the support for institutional theory based on the relationships with goal 1 and goal 2, being those external organizational image and local internal organizational image constructs. So this is a listing of things that I'm currently working on. The top paper, the testing the effects of people, processes, and technology, is the work that I was talking about coming out of the Stockton, California PD site visit. That paper is getting ready to go back out at ASC. We had originally submitted it to a forensic science journal, and we had a positive review, one middle-of-the-road review, and one not very friendly review. And so the editor went with the middle-of-the-road and the not very friendly, but rightly so. One of the primary criticisms was that there's just not enough forensic science in this paper for a forensic science journal. So they gave us a lot of good feedback, which we're going to take and actually turn back around pretty quickly. The next paper is the organizational and environmental determinants related to the Niagara project overall, looking at the efficiency of labs. And that paper is hopefully going out shortly. That's a paper I'm collaborating with Bill King and Brad Campbell on. The role of institutional sovereigns in shaping local law enforcement agency goals is just a continuation of this project, really focusing, though, on the agency goals. And the project that I have that's moving pretty quickly and is the one I'm directing most of my work on right now is related to the structure and function, impact on employment of women in law enforcement. But other than these projects, things that I bring to the table are the ability to do original data collection. Most of my time in grad school was spent doing original data collection. Those are projects that I still have access to, so I'm finally getting into writing the papers out of those since, for three and a half years we were collecting the data, and we continue to collect the data, but I'm not at Sam Houston anymore to be doing that actively. I also have experience with secondary data analysis, specifically the Law Enforcement Management and Administrative Statistics Survey, or LEMAS. So I have experience doing that, and that's where the data for the structure and function paper come from. This is a paper that I presented with my co-author at ASC this year, and we're looking at rates of women in policing and how there may be organizational impediments to that. And if you look at the work of Cordner and Cordner back from 2011, they talk about how women in policing probably plateaued in the late 90s, and we see this plateau of women in policing currently. Although gains were made for women in policing in the 80s and early 90s. One of the things I think that we need to address, though, looking at Cordner and Cordner's piece, which is a fantastic article, is that they're looking only at large policing organizations. They're not looking at policing overall. So we need to take into account small police agencies as well. But we want to look at what factors impact employment of women in law enforcement and how institutional constructs specifically impact the percentage of women in police departments. So I mentioned looking at the differences between small police departments and large police departments, and then overall. Blue being small departments with 0 to 99 full-time female employees, large departments being the yellow departments, and then green being overall. This next slide with the trend line shows this a little better, because you see that overall policing has not increased the number of women substantially since 1987. There's been an increase of almost 18%, but in large police departments that increase has been 40%, while in small departments it's been 0.6%. So we actually see in small departments that women dipped and then have increased steadily since 1993, but that is kind of washed out when you look at the fact that there's been a 40% increase in the large departments. So if we look at that overall, we see that the gains have not been as substantial as we had previously thought. So in conducting this research, we looked at the Law Enforcement and Administrative Statistics Survey, which is managed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's distributed about every 3 years. So we used data from all of the years listed except 1999 because gender was not included as a variable in the 1999 survey. We also had to do a trend analysis because we couldn't do a longitudinal analysis. Lemus questions fall off the survey, they change, response categories change from each iteration of the survey. Also, some things may have been on the 87 survey, the 93 survey, and then they're not on any other surveys. Community policing doesn't come onto the survey until 97, and then you see the 99 survey is almost completely directed at community policing. But with Lemus, you have a long-form survey, which is distributed to large self-representing departments with 100 full-time sworn officers or more. And then it's also distributed to a stratified random sample of those smaller agencies with 0 to 99 full-time officers. But it's a mailed single point of contact survey that's completed and then returned. The organizational variables and organizational constructs are pretty much agreed upon by researchers in this area. If you look to the work of Langworthy and his book in '86, McGuire's book in 2003, they really establish how these things are identified and how those variables are constructed. And this is just a listing of some of the common variables, and these are variables that we used in the research. There's also a systematic literature review that evaluated uses of Lemus variables, and that was a paper that I published with, again, Brad Campbell and Bill King. These are just more of the organizational variables and constructs that are typically agreed upon, and they're also, again, measured in the same way throughout the literature. So we see these are our preliminary findings. Those departments that are more formalized, so they have more written rules and procedures, are more likely to have female police officers. The larger organizations are more likely to have women. Organizational benevolence is a variable. I called it organizational benevolence. It is also called special pay. Several authors have identified it as a different name, but they use the same variables in their measure. But organizational benevolence is educational incentive pay, merit pay, military pay. They're extra pays to the base salary. And then vertical height looks at the social distance between the police chief and entry-level officers. And as departments there's a greater gap in that vertical height, there are more female police officers. And then we also see that there are impediments to women in policing, like collective bargaining, civilianization being the number of civilians, or excuse me, the percentage of civilians in an organization, those pre-employment screening measures that agencies use, and the total academy and field training time that recruits experience. Other than that, though, I would be happy to take more questions now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Matt?
I was just going to ask a question. In the beginning, you were talking about ballistics, and then you talked about works in progress with the ballistics.
Yes.
I'm sorry, how is that related to this?
Which part?
So with the ballistics, how does that, I mean, yes, the testing of the ballistics evidence on productivity.
Yes.
And then in the beginning, before you started, you were talking about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the, is it just totally separate from your presentations with the, looking at police chiefs and their perceptions and the
Yes.
institutional? Oh, okay.
Yes, I wanted to
kept,
let you know
trying to figure
the
out.
things
Oh,
that
okay.
I have done, my background.
Okay.
The ballistic stuff
Okay.
is really related to my interest in organizational theory.
Right, because so when we were talking
Yeah.
about that in the beginning, I thought that was tied in with
No,
the
sorry,
police
I didn't make that more
perceptions.
clear, no.
No, it's
no,
okay,
those-
I was just waiting for it, and never saw it, okay. So
Well,
that's why,
I think I never got
No, that's okay, that makes sense, that it was totally separate. Okay.
Yes, I wanted to let you know a quick overview of
Yeah,
everything
you're
that I'm working
interested in.
on,
Okay.
everything that I'm interested in, and then present my primary project,
Right.
which is police chiefs' perceptions of their
I gotcha.
institutional environment.
That makes sense then, okay, great, thanks.
Yep.
Really interesting.
Thanks.
Did you find some good interest from Chief Masterson today at the agency lunch?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
bet, yeah, I bet he'd be interested in that. I mean, he's leaving, he's retiring, but.
Yeah, that's unfortunate,
I
but
bet he had some opinions about that though.
he agreed with some of the things, and, you know, he had some points and things that I wanted to emphasize with succession planning and how we develop leadership, and he was just talking about how, you know, that's not done
Yeah,
typically.
right.
So, yeah, those are things that I would love to work on more, and especially if he was still the chief, that would be a fantastic project to really get into.
That would be really interesting. I'm sure we'll have another chief that's like that. They all seem to be pretty interested in the research and very
Mhm.
supportive of Boise State, so. Yeah, cool.
So Matt, in the police chief survey, I
Yes.
noticed when you were showing the different variables that you had assessed,
Mhm.
I didn't see sex there. So was that not measured, or was there no
We
variation?
have
unfortunately?
4% female police chiefs in Texas.
I figured that was
Yeah.
probably the problem.
We also considered prior military experience. We considered whether they were married, divorced, single. There just wasn't enough variation to include those.
Yeah. And you were talking about how females are not as involved in law enforcement in smaller agencies. So I guess what kind of, do you think are some of the correlates of that? Are those community level variables? Do you think they're like social cultural things? That women don't belong in law enforcement, that kind of stuff?
I think if you look anecdotally at articles that have been printed based on qualitative interviews, police chiefs are going to say that, you know, they're doing a lot to recruit women. They're not going to have the perceptions of their department that women do. Even recent articles in the last 5 years are showing that women still perceive policing as a good old boy network. The academy is not female friendly. They feel that there's that male camaraderie, that they're treated as outsiders in the academy. So there are still those barriers to women that even if police leaders aren't recognizing it, women themselves are recognizing it. And Cordner's article points out that in their survey of women in 3 counties in Pennsylvania, there are other employment opportunities that are more appealing to women in those areas. So they seek out that type of employment rather than policing. They talk about how you see more women in policing in large urban agencies because it's more appealing to women in large urban areas. So there's more emphasis on female policing, or females being police officers, whereas it's not nearly emphasized as much in rural communities.
Right.
Can I see that graph one more time with the metaphor? I was just curious, it's really interesting. The bar graph with that.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah. So we see that the local criminal justice organizations, yeah, are the most important.
And then number 2 is the medical providers.
Yes. And again, I think that is the close interaction between local hospitals and fire and EMS in Texas. I also think that the law enforcement employee and community organizations is rated so low because the union questions are there. In Texas being a right to work state, they have very low perceptions of organized labor.
Gotcha. So many steps. Cool.
And the national media being the lowest, I guess, is not really that surprising.
No.
The other thing I think that may have impacted the national media though is it's Texas and
Texas thinks it's its own country, right? So.
not everyone in Texas, but the print media that we put on the survey was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the
Yeah.
Washington Post. Texas chiefs aren't interested in East Coast goings on.
Yeah.
So that I think is why that major city newspaper loaded highly on national media as well, because many of the chiefs talk about reading the Houston paper, the Dallas paper, the Austin paper, and they're within that triangle, so they attribute a lot of significance to those papers, but those being within the state, we wanted to consider those local media.
Have they seen some of the results of these, and what kinds of responses have you received?
They actually have. I actually put together an executive summary that was given to the chiefs recently, and from what we would do is every 6 months we would put together a summary. We would take a portion of the survey and tell chiefs about that. And I'm really happy about this part because they identify these groups as well, and they also agree with the mean level of importance. But we looked at crises that chiefs face, whether those be natural disasters, terrorism, other types of issues that chiefs could have. So we looked at crisis, we looked at the number of hours that they attribute each week to crisis planning. We also considered communication networks that chiefs maintain, and we looked at employee misconduct. Our employee misconduct measure, I don't want to say failed miserably, but it kind of failed miserably. The chiefs explained to us, because we were looking at whether if there was a rumor that an employee had engaged in misconduct, how serious that was. If there was a rumor outside the organization, how serious that was. And then if there was substantial evidence outside the organization that this misconduct did occur, how serious is that? And we expected there to be varying levels of varying levels of importance, how damaging it could be to the department. But one of the chiefs took us aside and said, look, if this happens anywhere, it's a 10 in my department, because we had them rank it 0 to 10, being 0 not important at all, 10 being incredibly important. And chiefs are like, we're law enforcement, we don't deal with misconduct. Any misconduct, you address that early, you make sure that it's taken care of. So, if it's an internal issue, it's still serious in my book, because I have to address that with my employee. Now, if it's external, it's just as serious, but that might be addressed in the media. You're going to have to come out with a statement. So to them, it doesn't matter who knows, it's all incredibly important to them. And then with the crisis stuff, we've gotten good feedback, but the crises don't impact all of the agencies in the same way. So one of the criticisms of our survey actually came from the chief that I pre-tested it with at the ISD department. And he said, this is a great survey for a local police department. There are so many things in here that, while I could address, I don't, because I deal with students all day. Also, when you have questions that were related to bomb scares, terrorism in ports, the Port Authority police said that they train for those quite frequently. Other jurisdictions said, I don't even have a port in my jurisdiction, so no, this takes none of my time. But I think we've gotten good feedback. We haven't necessarily received a letter of support from anyone. One of the things that I hope to do, though, the president of IACP is the police chief at the University of Central Florida, so in hoping to take this national, I'm hoping to get a letter of support from IACP. And frankly, that letter from IACP, I think, is going to carry a lot of weight with chiefs.
Oh, yeah. That would be really great. What are the policy implications from your research, do you think? I mean, how would you extend this with locally here? What are you hoping to achieve with policy?
I think
anything?
With policy, one of the things, maybe not the policy is that we need to realize, based on the environments of chiefs, that they're not one size fits all. So we need to be careful when we're drafting our policies to not try to just lump all police organizations into one category, because police don't view the external environment as one category, so we can't view the police as one category. So we have to be mindful of the types of sovereigns that are in their environment, who they interact with. We have to be mindful of history within those organizations, and how there may be a need to repair relationships at the local organization level, local criminal justice organization level. The other thing that I think when it comes to policy implications is we need to be aware of how the police are perceived by the community. And that feeds into this as well, because social reality is a one-way street. It's an interactive process between the community and the police. So that's something that we need to be mindful of when we're crafting policy.
Yeah, I was just thinking with local CJ organizations being the most important, finding that there will be some really good policy implications there for those relationships with police chiefs and those agencies, which
I think
here I think we have.
that type of relationship is kind of carried over into the task forces that
Exactly,
chiefs participate in.
Yeah,
And so that is one of the things that
yeah,
would be a big policy implication.
that's
It's
what I was
just
thinking,
kind
yeah.
of, when it comes to the task force, playing well with others and, you know, a
Exactly.
mutual respect for each other, you know, not those side deals that kind of can happen sometimes.
Right, absolutely. That's great.
Do you have plans to replicate this at all? Because this was just Texas, right?
This was just Texas. I would like
maybe
to
in another
replicate
state.
this. Anyone that has funding to assist me in replicating this would be much appreciated. But that's,
that up.
yeah, why I applied to that internal grant at UCF to try to get a national sample. And then I know Brad Campbell and Bill King are trying to get money as well. So rather than looking at just a sample, we've got, you know, our big dreams are to basically create a census and survey all police organizations, maybe sheriffs first, because sheriffs are going to have a different institutional environment than police. So there are about 3,300 counties in the country, which would be a manageable number. We're going to have to take a sample of local law enforcement agencies, maybe match that, or determine what statistical power we'll need, but yeah, we would like to have a whole national sample of police chiefs. Hi. Any other questions?
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.